The morning they came to take the last chair, Nora Voss stood in the doorway of what had been her kitchen and watched two men she had never met carry a Windsor back through the hall as though it owed them something. She was 7 months along. She had $2,200 in a checking account under her own name, a title to a piece of land in Harlan County that she had never seen, and a contractor's bag packed with what the lawyer had confirmed was legally hers: a wool coat, 2 sets of clothes, a folder of documents her father had mailed her 3 years before, with a note that read only, "For when you need it." She had not understood what he meant then. She understood now. That morning belongs to the origin of everything that followed, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment before moving forward, because the woman who walked out of that house was not the woman who would walk into the community center in Harlan County 14 months later on a July afternoon so close and breathless it felt as though the whole valley had drawn one enormous breath and was holding it. On that later day, she would stand at the front of a folding table meeting with every farmer in the county who still had a well, and the man from the Meridian Land and Water Consortium who had been buying those wells up since the previous September, and the room would be waiting on what she said. The land would have already given its verdict. She would simply have to translate it. But first, the house in Columbus, the chair going out the door, and the arithmetic of what she had. She had learned the arithmetic slowly over the preceding 11 months, in the way that a person learns a language not in a classroom, but by being dropped without warning into a country where no one speaks anything else. Her ex-husband, whose name was Derek, and who was by profession a project manager and by nature a man who understood leverage before he understood anything else, had exited the marriage with the acuity of someone who had been quietly preparing for it while she had not been. The Columbus house was in his name alone. They had agreed to that arrangement when they bought it because his credit score was better and the rate differential had mattered, and she had been, she would later reflect without much bitterness, the kind of woman who agreed to arrangements. The car was in his name. The joint account had been drained legally, cleanly. 2 days before he filed, the money moved to a business account that predated the marriage and was therefore his entirely. The attorney she could afford for 6 hours told her that Derek had been careful, and that careful men were expensive to fight. She stopped fighting at hour 6. The child she was carrying had no name yet. Nora called her the passenger in her own head, and occasionally aloud, because the word felt honest without being cold. The passenger was coming in November, and it was early September, and Nora had $2,200 and a title to 41 acres of land in Harlan County, Kentucky, left to her in her father's will 2 years before. She had paid the property taxes on it twice, remotely, without ever visiting, because her father had said it was rough country, and the cabin on it had not been lived in for 15 years, and there was no sense going down unless you meant to stay. She had never meant to stay. She meant to stay now. The drive took 6.5 hours in a car borrowed from her friend Claudette, who had packed the back seat with canned goods and a space heater and a first aid kit, and had embraced her for a long time in the driveway without saying anything about what a bad idea this was, which was the greatest kindness anyone showed her that autumn. Nora drove south on roads that gradually shed their commerce and their width, and by the time she reached the county road that the deed described, the sky had gone the dark orange of late September, and the hills on either side were thick with trees going rust and amber, and the whole world smelled like creek water and cold stone. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined and in better condition than she had feared. Her father, whose name was William Voss, and who had been a quiet, methodical man with a surveyor's habit of measuring things before he touched them, had kept the roof sound and the well sealed. The door was swollen in its frame. The windows were filthy. The propane tank was empty. The wood stove was functional. She had $2,200 and 41 acres, and a wood stove that worked, and the first thing she did was build a fire. The township of Gideon's Flat, which served Harlan County's western tier, had a population of roughly 800 people, and the social architecture common to a place that had seen enough newcomers come and go to develop a polite, durable skepticism toward all of them. They were not cruel people. They were, most of them, people who had learned to reserve their energy and their trust for what had proven itself, and a pregnant woman who showed up alone in September in old Voss's cabin did not yet qualify as anything that had proven itself. The hardware store owner, whose name was Garrett, gave her a 10% reduction on the pipe fittings she needed for the water line, and did not ask her questions, which she took as a form of kindness. The woman at the county clerk's office processed her transfer of residence paperwork with efficient neutrality. The man who ran the propane service, whose name was Phil Briggs, came out and filled the tank and charged her the standard rate and looked at her belly once and then looked away and said the propane might run low by February if she wasn't careful. And she thanked him and said she would be careful. The first time she went to the feed store, which she had no immediate reason to visit, but which was also the place where mail was informally sorted for the rural routes because the post office had closed 4 years ago. A man named Clyde Mather was holding court near the front counter with 2 other men she would come to know as Herschel Dobbs and Ray Tillman, prosperous by local measure, men who ran the kind of mid-sized cattle operations that the county considered its productive backbone. Clyde Mather saw Nora, took in her condition, looked at the wool coat that was slightly too thin for the elevation, and said loud enough that she was clearly meant to hear that it looked like old Voss's place was going to get itself a story. The men laughed. Nora selected her mail from the box her father had maintained and walked back to her car. Being right, she told herself on that drive home, is its own kind of reply. She did not yet know what she would be right about. She said it like a person learning a prayer before they understand the faith, because it sounded like the kind of thing that might be true if she gave it time enough to become true. She had 41 acres and $2,140 and 7 weeks until November. The cabin had a root cellar that she had not initially noticed because it was accessed through a hatch beneath the kitchen table, and in that root cellar her father had left, among other things, a 10-year-old notebook in his surveyor's hand that documented the property in the specific, patient way he documented everything: the watershed, the spring seep on the eastern slope, the soil composition by section, the microclimate created by the ridgeline that meant the northeast corner of the property stayed wet when everything around it dried. He had noted the depth of the spring at 3 different seasons and had written, in the margin of the spring page, in slightly different ink as though it was added later, "This water does not leave." She read that sentence several times and filed it away. The passenger arrived on the 14th of November at Harlan ARH Hospital, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with her grandfather's calm forehead and her mother's hands, and Nora named her Iris after the first wildflower she had identified on the property the previous October, a late-season specimen pushing through the ridge clay that had seemed to her at that moment a form of argument. The nurses were kind. Claudette drove 6.5 hours to be there and drove 6.5 hours back the next day. Nora came home to the cabin with Iris and the wood stove and the notebook and the arithmetic. The arithmetic by November looked like this: $960 remaining, no income, and the property taxes due again in April. She had no car of her own. Claudette's borrowed vehicle had been returned. The land was what she had. She had started reading the notebook more carefully in the weeks before Iris arrived, because reading was the only labor she could perform in the final month without discomfort, and because the notebook had begun to seem to her less like a record of a piece of land and more like a letter written in a language she was learning to translate. Her father had been a hydrogeologist before his retirement, a professional reader of water beneath earth, and the notebook was a hydrogeologist's notebook applied to a personal property, which meant it was dense with measurements and cross-references and observations made at different seasons. The spring on the eastern slope reappeared in the notes frequently. He had measured its output in 3 consecutive drought summers. He had noted that in the worst of those summers it had decreased by only 11%, while the creek on the property's western edge had dropped by 60. He had drawn a small, precise diagram of what he believed the geology to be: a fractured limestone shelf at depth, a confined aquifer feeding upward through the fault that the ridge sat on, the spring seep as the surface expression of something much larger and much more stable than it appeared. She read this in early October, sitting by the wood stove with the fire going and the trees outside gone entirely bare, and she felt something she could not have named precisely, but that she would later describe to Claudette as the sensation of a door opening inward rather than outward. She had not understood when she arrived why her father had said this water does not leave. She understood now. The spring was not a surface feature, it was a mouth. There was an old man who lived a mile and a half up the ridge road in a house he had built himself from lumber. He had milled himself from trees he had felled himself some time in the 1970s, and his name was Vasile Oprea. And he had come to Harlan County from a village in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania in 1971, brought by a coal company for his expertise in underground water management, and left behind when the company folded, and he had stayed because the hills reminded him enough of the hills he had left. He was 81 years old, and his English was precise and slightly formal, a language he had learned as an adult and treated with the respect of an acquisition rather than a birthright. He grew vegetables in terraced beds cut into the slope. He kept bees. He had a reputation in Gideon's Flat as a man who knew things about the land that the land had not told anyone else, and people consulted him occasionally and uneasily, the way they might consult an oracle they were not entirely sure they believed in. He came to see her in early December, walking down the ridge road in a wool coat that was much warmer than hers, and carrying a jar of honey and a jar of pickled beets and a small wrapped parcel that turned out to be a hand-knitted garment for Iris. He sat in the chair she offered him near the stove and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who had seen many things and found newborns reliably interesting, and he drank the tea she made and was quiet for a while in the way of someone who is reading the room rather than preparing a remark. Then he said, "Your father showed me the notebook before he died. He said the land would explain itself if you were patient enough to listen. He said you were someone who knew how to be patient. He asked me to come tell you this when you arrived, but I wanted to wait until you had read it for yourself, so you would know it was true before I told you." She looked at him. She said, "You knew him." "He knew me first," Vasile said. "He came to my door in 2009 and asked me to look at the spring. He had read about the fault geology in the county survey records, and he wanted another opinion. We spent 2 days with measuring equipment on your eastern slope. He was correct about what is below. He was very careful man." She asked him, "How stable is it?" Vasile tilted his head. He said, "I have a saying from my village which does not translate exactly. The closest is, the root that grows in rock does not need to fear the dry summer. Your spring comes from the rock, from deep. It is not a surface gift. It is a structural one." After he left, she sat with that phrase and turned it like a stone in her hand. The root that grows in rock does not need to fear the dry summer. She wrote it in the margin of her father's notebook below the entry about the spring's output in drought conditions. She would write it again later in 2 other places, and it would mean something different and something more each time. She did not tell anyone about the spring, not because she was strategic exactly, but because she had learned in the preceding year that the things you announce before they are finished become the things that people take from you, and she had very little left that she was willing to lose. She told Iris about it, in the way that mothers of very young infants tell their children things they will not remember, because the telling is for the teller. She said, Your grandfather found this for us. This is what he left us. She was correct that Iris would not remember. She was also correct that the land remembered. By February, she had $540. She had done two things to extend the money. She had begun doing remote bookkeeping work for a small construction company in Harlan via a connection her father had maintained with the owner, and she had begun, quietly, systematically, mapping the spring's output and the surrounding soil moisture in the notebook's remaining pages, because her father had stopped his measurements in the spring of 2019, and there was a gap in the record that she could fill. The work of filling it was painstaking and took hours she could not always spare, but she found, in a way she had not anticipated, that the measuring steadied her. It was the hydrogeologist's habit of her father becoming hers, the discipline of attending to the actual rather than the feared. The boy appeared in March. His name was Ellis Dobbs, the youngest child of Herschel Dobbs, who had laughed with Clyde Mather at the feed store in September, and Ellis was 9 years old and possessed of the specific silence of a child who has learned that the safest position in a loud house is not to be noticed. He appeared at her fence line one afternoon when she was measuring the spring output with a bucket and a stopwatch, and he watched her for 20 minutes without speaking. And then he said, "What are you counting?" She told him. He considered this. He said, "How come?" She explained that her father had kept count before her, and she was continuing the record. Ellis looked at the spring seep, which was a modest thing, a darkening of the clay at the base of the ridge, and a thin thread of water emerging from the rock face and feeding into a channel that she had cleared of debris. He said, "It doesn't look like much." She said, "Most useful things don't, from the outside." He came back the next day and the day after that. He named the spring Old Reliable, which she found both literal and endearing, and he named the 5 white oaks on the eastern slope by their shapes, the spread one, the tall one, the bent one, the low one, and the one that grew funny. He held Iris with the careful gravity of a child who had been trusted with something and took that trust seriously. He did not report her measurements to his father, or if he did, Herschel Dobbs showed no sign of having received information he found interesting. The summer was dry. It was dry in the way that summers in Harlan County were sometimes dry, which was aggressively and without apology. The heat, arriving in June and settling like a creditor who had been patient long enough and was now present to collect. The creek on the property's western edge dropped to a trickle by July. The lawns in Gideon's Flat went brown. The cattle operations began moving animals to any pasture that still had green, which was less and less pasture as the summer went on. Old Reliable did not stop. It decreased, as her father had noted it would, 11% by her measurement in August compared to the previous August's baseline, which she now had. But 11% of what it had been was still, by any reasonable accounting, a great deal of water emerging from a fractured limestone shelf in a summer when the county's surface water was vanishing. The spring fed a small pond she had dug out in June, and the pond held, and the grass around it held, and the 41 acres of the Voss property were, by August, the greenest 41 acres in the valley. She did not advertise this. She kept the measurements in the notebook. She told Vasile, who nodded and said, "Now you understand what your father understood, and what the village in Carpathia understood, that it is better to know the depth of your well before the summer than to discover it during." He paused and then said, "The root that grows in rock." She said, "Does not need to fear the dry summer." He smiled. He said, "Just so." It was the outside validator who arrived first, in the form of a woman named Patricia Sweeney, who operated a sustainable farm operation in Breathitt County and had heard, through a roundabout chain of agricultural contacts, that the Voss property in Gideon's Flat had running water when nothing else did. She drove up the county road in a pickup truck with a Breathitt County Farm Bureau sticker on the bumper and knocked on the cabin door on a Tuesday morning in late August with the directness of someone who had not driven 60 miles to be indirect. She explained what she had heard and asked if it was true, and asked what Nora would want for temporary grazing rights to the wet portion of the property, perhaps a dozen head of cattle for 6 weeks while the crisis sorted itself out. Nora named a figure. Patricia Sweeney looked at her for a moment and said that was very fair. She wrote a check on the spot for 1/3 of the amount as a deposit and said she would settle the remainder on pickup. She shook Nora's hand and said, "I heard you were down here alone with an infant, and the whole county thought you'd be gone by Christmas. I like being the first person in the room who was wrong about something." Nora said, "You weren't in the room. You weren't one of them." Patricia Sweeney said, "Better still." The check was for $480. It was the first money the land had made. Nora sat at the kitchen table that evening with Iris on her knee and the notebook open and a pencil in her hand, and wrote the number in the margin of the spring page, and then sat for a while in the blue dark of an August evening, not quite smiling, but something close to it. The Meridian Land and Water Consortium had been operating in Harlan County since the previous September, which was to say, since before Nora had arrived, though she had not known it then. Its local representative was a man named Garrett Tolliver, no relation to the hardware store Garrett, who operated from an office in the Harlan town seat, and who had the appearance and manner of a man who had been trained to project the impression of neighborly concern while conducting the business of extraction. He wore pressed shirts in muted plaids that suggested he had consulted someone on what pressed shirts in muted plaids suggested, and he drove a truck that was new enough to be clearly expensive and old enough in its model to be clearly calibrated. He had, by the time Nora became aware of him in August, already purchased water rights from 4 properties in the county and was in negotiation for 3 more, all of them well owners who had received offers at the moment when the drought made their water suddenly valuable, and their financial reserves were thin enough that the offer felt like grace. He came to her door on a Thursday morning in late August, when the heat was at its worst, and he introduced himself and said he had heard she was managing the spring on the eastern slope, and that he represented a consortium that was very interested in supporting small landholders through the current difficulty, that there might be a partnership arrangement that would benefit her considerably, and that he would love to discuss it over coffee if she had a minute. He had a way of letting the word partnership sit in the air with a warmth that the word did not quite earn. She gave him coffee. She listened. The offer, when it arrived after 20 minutes of preliminary warmth, was a long-term water rights lease. Meridian would install infrastructure at their cost, extract the spring's output at a rate to be determined, and pay her a flat annual fee of $3,000 for a 20-year term with no renegotiation clause. He presented this as a considerable relief from the burden of managing the resource alone. She said, "The spring output in a normal year runs to approximately 160,000 gallons a month. At the current rate for agricultural water in a shortage, that's between $9,000 and $15,000 of value a month. You're offering me $3,000 a year." He blinked once and then smiled and said that was a creative way to frame it, but that, of course, the spring's output was variable and the current shortage was temporary, and that the extraction and infrastructure costs were not trivial, and that the certainty of income ought to count for something for a woman in her position. She heard what was in that phrase. She said, "I appreciate the visit. I'll be in touch if I change my mind." He drove away, and she watched the dust settle behind his truck and thought that she had lived long enough with a man who understood leverage to know exactly what leverage sounded like when it was wearing a muted plaid shirt. She was not in touch. He came back twice more in September. His tone, each time, was slightly more compressed, the warmth slightly more effortful, like a man who is accustomed to the first offer being accepted and is recalibrating without having the tools to recalibrate gracefully. The third visit included a remark about whether she had considered that the county health board had jurisdiction over unregistered water sources, and that it might be worth ensuring her spring's documentation was in order, which was the legal coercion arriving dressed as concern. She thanked him again for his time. After the third visit, she called Patricia Sweeney in Breathitt County and asked her, as a woman who had been farming in this region for 20 years and understood its civic architecture, what Meridian's pattern was. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then said, "They buy the wells first, then they buy the neighbors, because the neighbors have no water, then they own the valley." She said, "They've done it in 3 other counties I can name." She said, "If you have something they want and you won't sell it, the next move is usually to make sure everyone around you is desperate enough that you become the problem." This was useful information. She filed it in the same place she filed everything that needed to be held and not acted on until the moment was right. The moment arrived in October on a Tuesday, when Clyde Mather came up the county road in his truck and sat in the driveway for a full 2 minutes before he got out. She watched him from the window. He was a big man in his early 60s who had spent his life moving through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been in a position where asking cost him anything, and she could see, even from the window, that this was costing him something considerable. He got out of the truck and stood in the drive and took off his hat. He put it back on. He took it off again. He walked to the door. He said, "My wells are dry, both of them. I've got 48 head that I can't keep going through November on what I've got left in my tanks," he said, looking at the middle distance rather than at her. "I heard you've still got water on the eastern slope, and I heard you had that Breathitt County woman's cattle up here for 6 weeks, so I know you've had arrangements with people." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I was not a kind person to you when you came here. I know it. I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment and thought about a man who understood leverage and about what it meant to understand leverage and what it meant not to. She said, 48 head for how long? He said he'd need 6 weeks minimum, maybe 8. She named a figure. It was fair. It was not punitive. It was what she had charged Patricia Sweeney, adjusted for the number of animals and the duration, and it was calibrated to be something that Clyde Mather could pay, which she knew from the county tax records was available to him. He looked at the figure, and she could see him expecting something worse and adjusting to what was actually in front of him. He said, "That's fair." She said, "I need you to tell anyone else who asks that the rate is the same and that I'll hear them out." She said, "I'm not running a rescue operation, but I'm not running a predatory one either." She said, "If a family can't cover it fully, we'll work something out in labor on the property." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes, but close enough to count, "I misjudged you. I misjudged this whole thing." She said, "You had information I didn't yet have. We both had to wait for it." He looked at her then, properly, and she saw something move across his face that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man revising a story he had been telling himself. He drove back down the county road. She stood in the doorway for a while after his truck disappeared and listened to the valley and thought about her father and about the notebook and about the root that grows in rock and about whether fairness was its own kind of answer to a question that she had been asked for 14 months. Ellis Dobbs appeared at the fence line that afternoon as she was finishing the spring measurement, and he said, "Was that my dad?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Is he going to be okay?" She said, "Yes. His cattle are going to be fine." Ellis nodded and sat on the fence rail and looked at Old Reliable. He said, "I told him you were smart." He said he knew. She understood that this was a translation of something more complicated and more painful, and she did not press it. By the second week of October, she had arrangements with 7 operations in the valley covering a total of 212 head of cattle at a combined income that she had not permitted herself to calculate until it was confirmed, because she had learned in the preceding year not to count money she could not yet touch. When she calculated it, the number was $11,400, payable over the autumn. She sat with this number in the way that she had sat with the spring's output numbers, measuring it against the arithmetic of what had come before. Then she thought about Garrett Tolliver's offer of $3,000 a year, and allowed herself a single quiet moment that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family as one. The community center meeting was called for the 14th of July of the following year, which was to say, after the winter and a spring that had been dry enough to confirm that the previous year's drought was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a pattern. The County Extension Service had documented it. The regional news had begun covering it, and Garrett Tolliver had spent the preceding 8 months aggressively converting his initial purchases into a water distribution network that he was now proposing to the county as a managed solution to the regional shortage, at pricing that made Patricia Sweeney's estimate of $9,000 to $15,000 per month look like an understatement. The meeting was nominally a county information session. In practice, it was the moment when Meridian was going to make public what everyone already understood privately, that they now controlled most of the valley's accessible water, that their pricing would reflect the shortage, and that the few remaining independent sources were either too small to matter or would be absorbed in the coming months. Tolliver had filed 2 weeks before the meeting a petition with the County Health Board to have all unregistered private water sources in the valley inspected for compliance with the state's Agricultural Water Management Code, a provision that, as he surely knew and she also knew, was technically applicable to her spring and had teeth enough to create significant delay and legal cost in its enforcement. She had called the County Health Board herself the week the petition was filed and had spoken with the director, a methodical woman named Sheila Prater, who had explained the relevant statutes and timelines and had mentioned, without emphasis, that compliance documentation filed ahead of an inspection generally resolved matters much more efficiently than documentation filed in response to one. Nora had filed the documentation 2 days later, complete and accurate, including her father's notebook as an exhibit, which she had digitized at the Harlan Library the previous spring against exactly this kind of contingency. The Health Board had confirmed compliance 8 days before the community center meeting. She arrived at the meeting early enough to sit near the front, which she had not done before in this community, but which seemed, on this occasion, correct. Iris was with Vasile Oprea, who had offered without being asked. Ellis Dobbs was there with his father, seated 3 rows behind her. She did not turn to look, but she heard Herschel Dobbs's voice in the general noise, and it sounded, to her ear, like the voice of a man who was there because he needed to be, rather than because he wanted to be. Tolliver ran the first 40 minutes of the meeting with the polished efficiency of someone who had run meetings like this before and understood the value of controlling the pace. The numbers he presented were real. She could not fault the numbers except in their framing, which was the framing of inevitability. He described the consortium's investment in infrastructure. He described the severity of the shortage and its projected continuation. He named the price per 1,000 gallons for agricultural use under the new managed system and let it sit in the room. It was 3 times the previous market rate. He said the alternative was to let the crisis proceed unmanaged. When the room was open for questions, she raised her hand, and he recognized her, and she was aware that he did not know her by name, which told her several things at once. She said, "You filed a petition with the County Health Board requesting inspections of unregistered private water sources." She said, "In that petition, you noted that the Voss property spring on Gideon's Flat Western Tier had an output of approximately 140,000 gallons per month." She paused and looked at him and said, "The county records for that property show no formal water source survey on file. The only measurements on record are my own, which I have filed with the Health Board under compliance documentation. I'm wondering how you arrived at that number." The room was quiet. Tolliver's expression did the thing that expressions do. When a man has been precise about something he was not supposed to be precise about. A compression, a recalibration happening visibly in real time. She said, "My property was posted for the past 11 months during the grazing arrangements. The spring enclosure is a quarter-mile from the county road, so I'm wondering who measured it." He said with considerable control that the consortium's assessment team had surveyed water sources throughout the valley as part of their regional planning. She said, "A posted property isn't accessible." She said it without heat, as a point of fact. Herschel Dobbs, behind her, said, "That's trespass." Ray Tillman said, "That's what it is." The room, which had been the particular silence of people listening to a man with numbers they did not like, became a different kind of silence, the kind that precedes a shift. She did not press the trespass further. She said, "I have a compliance-documented spring producing between 130 and 160,000 gallons per month, with consistent output verified across 3 drought seasons by engineering documentation in my father's name and 1 drought season in my own." She said, "I'm prepared to make that water available to the farming operations in this valley at cost, which is to say at the cost of maintaining the infrastructure and continuing the documentation, which comes to roughly $40 per 1,000 gallons at current volume, roughly 1/3 of what's being proposed by the consortium." She said, "The only condition is that the water not be resold to a third party." She said, "If operations in the valley want to formalize that arrangement, I can have a simple agreement drafted within 2 weeks." The room made a sound that was not quite a sound, but that she felt as a pressure change, as though the held breath of the whole valley had finally, quietly, begun to release. Clyde Mather, who had not spoken and who was not a man who showed emotion in public, stood up and removed his hat. He did not say anything. Herschel Dobbs did the same. Ray Tillman stood. Then several others. It was not a standing ovation, nothing so theatrical. It was something older and more plain-spoken than that, the gesture of a community acknowledging what it had previously refused to see. Tolliver said in a voice that was finding its control again that the consortium would be pursuing its legal options with respect to the County Health Board petition and the pricing arrangement she had described. She said, "They're welcome to. The documentation is filed and the compliance is confirmed." She said, "The spring was here before the consortium and it will be here after it." She gathered her folder and sat down. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, but she understood, and she believed most of the room understood, that the substantive business had been concluded. Vasile Oprea was sitting on her porch steps when she came home, Iris asleep against his shoulder, in the way that small children sleep against elderly people, with complete trust and complete weight. The evening was still warm, the heat of the long, dry summer not yet broken but different in character. Or perhaps she was different in character, perceiving it differently. The eastern slope in the late light was dark green, where everything surrounding it was brown. She sat beside him on the steps, and he looked at the slope for a while, and then said, "Your father would say the land kept its word," she said. "I think he'd say the land did what it always does. We're the ones who kept our word." He nodded slowly. He said, "The root that grows in rock does not need to fear the dry summer." He said it in Romanian first, the original phrase that did not translate exactly, and then in English. She repeated it back to him in English, and then asked him to say the Romanian again, slowly, so she could learn the sound of it, because it seemed to her that a thing like that deserved to be known in its original language, as well as in the one you happen to speak. The rains came in late October, not all at once, but in the gradual, incremental way of something that is changing its mind about a long-held position, 3 days of overcast, and then a steady 2-day rain, and then a morning when she came out of the cabin and the creek on the western edge of the property was running again, and the valley smelled like itself, and everything that had been waiting for water was remembering what water meant. She went to the spring on the eastern slope with the notebook and the stopwatch and measured the output, as she had measured it every month for 14 months now. The number was slightly above her baseline. She wrote it in the notebook in her own handwriting, next to her father's, the two records of the same source in the same place, one generation ending and one continuing. Ellis Dobbs appeared at the fence line, as he had appeared reliably for the better part of a year. He looked at the creek running on the far side of the property, and then at Old Reliable, and then at her. He said, "It worked out." She said, "It was always going to work out. We just had to wait for the land to show us where it already had." He considered this with the seriousness of a child who is filing something for later use. He said, "My dad says you're the best thing that happened to this valley since the road got paved." She said, "That's kind of him." Ellis said, "He means it. He's not that kind when he doesn't mean it." She smiled. She closed the notebook. She looked at the 41 acres of her father's land, and her land and Iris's land, the ridge above it and the limestone shelf below it, and the water that came up through the fault in the rock that did not go away in dry summers, the root that grew in rock, the thing that did not leave. There had been, 14 months ago, a woman alone in a cabin in Harlan County with a wood stove that worked, and $2,200, and a title to land everyone considered a burden rather than an asset. That phrase, "a woman alone," had been the way people said, "She will not last. She does not belong. She is not enough." It was a phrase that held a verdict in it without saying so plainly. She had decided somewhere in the months of measurement and cold and labor and calculation to let the phrase contain a different verdict, the one she was writing in the notebook week by week. A woman alone had mapped a spring that the whole valley had needed and not known to look for. A woman alone had read her father's letter in the language he had written it in, which was the language of patient attention and recorded fact. A woman alone had, when she held all the power, chosen to use it in a way that made the phrase no longer accurate, because she was no longer alone, because belonging is not given at arrival, but earned at the moment of choice, and she had made the choice. The land had kept its word. She had kept hers. That was the arithmetic she would carry forward, the only sum she needed to balance.